Hi, I'm Samantha Taylor, and I am a seventh grade English teacher at a middle school in Mississippi. But one of the things that I also do is teach a adult beginner ESL class through my church on Tuesday nights. And so I've had a lot of really new experience working with different international students and learning about their culture as they're also learning about English. And the majority of my students are from Spanish speaking countries. So I have students from Guatemala, Mexico, Venezuela, Argentina, Colombia. So I have students from all over. And I just wanted to take this opportunity with working on this presentation to just learn more about my students and more about their culture and where they're coming from. So I wanted to start just by clarifying what Hispanic means, because I know that there are some people who would identify as Hispanic, some who would identify as Latino, and some who would just kind of identify by whatever country they are actually from. But the US Census website defined Hispanic or Latino as a person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American, or other Spanish culture or origin, regardless of race. And based on the rest of the article, what I took that to mean is um, basically you can identify as what you want to identify as. Like if you are from a Spanish speaking country and you want to call yourself Hispanic, you can. If you would rather call yourself Latino, you can. If you'd rather stick with just the name of your country, you can. And all of that's okay. And Hispanic is just kind of a broad term to go across all of these different countries and the different commonalities between the cultures. So for this presentation, it's going to be separated into different sections. And so I'm starting with just kind of a brief overview of different areas of Hispanic culture or just the top of our iceberg that we've talked about. So I started with food, and all of these look absolutely delicious. And I did chat with some of my students from each of these countries, and they did confirm that these are some of their favorite foods that they do love to prepare and eat with their families. So for Argentina, the most popular food would be empanadas. And empanadas are a pastry or turnover that's filled with savory ingredients and they're served hot. For Colombia, they said arepas, which the dough here is like made of corn and they would be pressed into patties and then grilled and then stuffed with different things. So like this one's stuffed with cheese right here and then different meats and things. This one was probably like avocado, so it might be like a vegetarian version. Um, this is the dish from Guatemala, and it is a spicy stew. So typically the meat here is chicken, but it could also be made with pork or other meats. Um, and they're going to be served over rice and with corn tortillas. And this is kind of similar to a pancake where it's made of like ground corn and cheese and like prepared on a griddle, just like a pancake. And then it would be stuffed with queso and hot cheese. So those are some different foods from Hispanic culture. This one's from Venezuela. Um, Holidays are another big aspect of culture. So two big holidays. This is the Day of the Dead, which is normally characterized by this beautiful like face painting of making your face kind of look like a skull. It's bright colors. And the purpose of the Day of the Dead is to celebrate your ancestors, basically. They believe that between like October 31st and November 2nd, that the doors of heavens open and then relatives who had passed on would be able to return into the world of the living for a short time and be able to be with their family members that they've left behind. And so there would be big parties and dancing and feast. And the other big thing was people from Hispanic communities would set up ofrendas, and which would basically be kind of like a mantle within their house where they would have pictures of their loved ones, and also they would set up foods and drinks and candies and memorabilia of their loved one, so that when that loved one would return into the world of the living, they would be able to eat some of their favorite foods and look back at past memories and just feel loved and celebrated by their loved ones who are still on Earth. But this would definitely be a big deal. It's often confused as being like a Hispanic Halloween. And although the dates do kind of correspond in that way, it's not the same thing. And everything I've read pointed back to the fact that Hispanic people don't want the Day of the Dead to be compared to Halloween in that way. Um, this is the lighting of luminarias, which is these are little lanterns. That's what luminarias means, is little lanterns. And they're often lit and set out during Christmas season or during the winter as a way. Sometimes there's a religious affiliation with it. And if it is a religious affiliation, it's supposed to kind of represent the Star of David and kind of it's supposed to symbolically point the Holy Family, so like Mary and Joseph, to the inn where like Jesus was born, similar to how the Star of David was supposed to point them to where they're born. And so if a family is like Catholic, that might be luminarius might be a way to kind of like symbolically show their faith in that Christmas story. And typically that's shown on Christmas Eve, but they can also just be lit for different reasons. Sometimes it's for like if a person dies, it could be in memory of something. There were connections to, I believe, the Aztecs who might have done this first for different symbolic reasons. But more traditionally today, it's affiliated with like the Christmas season and with winter. And they're really pretty, is the big thing I notice about them. And so what they're made of, these are like brown paper bags. They're filled partway with sand. And then there's a little tea candle inside of it. And so it lights up the paper bag and gets this really pretty warm glow. Another big kind of holiday would be the National Hispanic Heritage Month, which is celebrated in the United States. And so it's normally celebrated between September 15th and October 15th. And the reason for that is because a lot of countries declared independence during that time period. So like here on September 15th, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua all declared their independence from Spain. Mexico's Independence Day is September 16th, and Chile's is September 18th. So all of these countries declared independence during this time period, and so that's why we tend to celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month in September. Here are some other traditions in Hispanic culture. A huge one is definitely quinceañeras. These are celebrated when a girl turns 15, and it's supposed to be her like passage from girlhood to womanhood. Historically, it would have been like a sign that this girl is now like of marriageable age, and now it's more associated with just like dating, if anything, but definitely not all families see this as a like a romantic relationship kind of signaling. It is supposed to be really important to the family, and it's supposed to be a time for the family to kind of like show off their daughter and celebrate her and celebrate what the family and the community has done to get this girl to the age of 15 and into adulthood, and celebrate the way that they've worked together to like nurture and raise her. It was typically celebrated in Mexico, Latin America, and the Caribbean, but it's definitely also celebrated within Hispanic and Latino communities in the United States. Traditionally, there would be a mass, so like a Catholic mass, for the daughter and her family and her godparents first. And then after the mass was over, there would be a big party for friends and families to attend with lots of food and dancing. The girl turning 15 would have a waltz with one of her friends or a boyfriend. She would get to dance with her father. There'd be lots of presents and things like that, but it's definitely a big deal and a big celebration. And there are some traditions here too where the girl turning 15 might give an old doll to a younger sister to mark like her leaving childhood and giving pieces of her childhood to the younger sister as she's moving into adulthood. And the girl turning 15 would also probably have a ceremony where she steps into high heeled shoes as another marker of womanhood. That's quinceañeras. Pinatas are another tradition that typically is seen at parties in Hispanic communities and also now outside of Hispanic communities because they've just grown popular in the United States. But typically they would be brought out at Christmas and birthdays, and they would be filled with candies and fruits. And people would sing songs while the children were breaking the pinatas. And I also thought this was interesting is that sometimes adults would set aside little like goodie bags of candies and fruits um, for children who might not be able to run fast enough to get the candies as it's breaking. And that way everyone would get something, even if they didn't get something specifically from the pinata. And another tradition is mariachi music, which would be mostly, as you can see, like different string instruments. We have like guitars and violins, and then the only like non-string instrument would be trumpets, which is what these are. They typically wear the attire of the cowboys of Jalisco, maybe is how that's pronounced. And so there'd be like matching uniforms with these really decorated trousers or pants. There'd be boots, wide bow ties, sombreros, and then like these short jackets. Two other traditions within Hispanic communities. This is healing, the tradition of healing. And so like specifically, traditionally, especially in a lot of Hispanic communities, there would be a healer who would know kind of like holistic medicine and be able to like use the earth and use what's around them in the community to be able to offer um, different like medicines to help with different like ailments. They would often also be like a midwife and be able to help with the birthing process. Um, they could also be like a pharmacist, like you could go with them to get medicine or like stuff for your cuts or bruises. They could also, in a lot of cases, act as a counselor and be able to be a person you could go to for advice and to talk to. But this person would be very highly recognized and valued within the community. I have a quote here that it says, their life is dedicated to the administration of remedies for mental, emotional, physical, and spiritual illnesses. So they would be the person you would go to for pretty much anything that's hurting you, whether that is physical or emotional. And this other quote says, times have changed. We don't rely on the healer as much, but you have other countries in Mexico and Latin America where people treasure the knowledge of the traditional healer, and sometimes they're the only doctor in the village. And so it just kind of depends on where you are if you would have much encounters with a healer. And then the last tradition I want to talk about is storytelling, which is something that a lot of Hispanic cultures value. Um, Here in the article I read, it said it's possibly one of the most important traditions, where we share stories of life, family, traditions, including first experiences celebrating the Day of the Dead to the smell of tamales drifting through Hispanic homes during the holidays. And so family would always gather together at the end of the day to just tell stories and unite through that kind of like shared experiences. And then lastly, this is a chart I found in an article actually discussing the best care practices for Hispanic patients. This is from a medical journal. But I also were able to find these same themes appear in articles about psychology and articles about education. And so I just thought this would be a good kind of like synopsis of different things that were valued in Hispanic culture. So the first one is family. it says there's an importance of family at all levels, nuclear, extended, and the need of the family can often take precedent over individual needs. And so in the article, it talked about how oftentimes patients might make a decision that would be better for their family rather than better for their own care. And so they always had to be like really delicate in dealing with those kinds of situations. And also it talked about like in the field of education, when children like go off to college, a Hispanic student might be more likely to be like either sending money back to their family or to rely more heavily on their family when making decisions about like what classes to take or about just different things in their lives. And so it was just kind of like culturally different than a lot of other students at different universities. And so it was just something to like be cognizant of. Um, this one person, Olismo, is like the display of mutual respect or trust building. And so this was talking about how specifically like in the world of medicine, patients have to be able to trust you. And so as like a teacher, it would be important to kind of like focus really heavily on building relationships with students so that they would be able to trust you and kind of get away from the idea that you're the teacher and they're the student and that there's this like kind of power dynamic here, which is similar to this respective hierarchy. You kind of have to break down that barrier in order to kind of build trust and build relationships. There's an emphasis on the present. There's less focus on like what's going to happen in the future in terms of like it talked about, especially within the medical field, if there's like a prevalent disease that maybe would get worse and worse in the future, they would be more concerned on like what was happening with that disease right now. And so it took extra effort for the doctors to be able to encourage the patient to kind of think long term in that way instead of just on the now. And this last one deals with the fact that a lot of Hispanic cultures can tend to be more spiritual. And it says belief that good evil spirits can affect the well-being and the spirit of the dead person. And so like if a person were to pass, they would continue to pray for the spirit of that person as they're making their way to the afterlife. Okay. And now I'm going to switch over to our Hispanic English language learners and their challenges and suggestions for what we can do in order to best serve them. So here are some challenges from an article I read that was called Barriers to Educational Opportunities for Hispanics in the United States. So it says initial disadvantages often stem from parents' immigrant and socioeconomic status and their lack of knowledge about the US education system. So typically, English language learners may come into the school at a disadvantage just because they don't have like the background knowledge of how schools in America tend to go. Their parents don't have that knowledge either. They may have either a very different educational background or they might have some distaste for education. And so that may cause a student to kind of be overwhelmed when entering the school system, which can cause them to either shut down or just it's something that you have to overcome. There can be a lack of exposure to literacy activities at home in an early formalized school setting. So they may be starting academically at a lower level than students who like went to preschool or different kindergartens areas. Teacher assessments of students' language proficiency influences instructional practices, which deals with like a teacher potentially thinking that an English language learner is on a lower level, not like academically, but intelligence wise, and then creating instructional practices that are not at the correct level for the student and kind of putting those assumptions on the student in a way that handicaps them because you're not giving them the challenge that they need. The relationship between Hispanic students and non-Hispanic teachers can cause problems. So like if a non-Hispanic teacher doesn't try to understand like the culture and tradition and background of the student, that can cause problems if they don't seek to understand the differences between like learning styles that may be there, that can cause problems. And how the lack of academic guidance pertaining to course selections and college choice impedes Hispanics from attending four-year colleges. They were looking at some census data from the early 2000s, so it's a little bit dated, but it was talking a lot about how Hispanic students were significantly less likely to go to a four-year college or a two-year college than white students or Asian students or even African American students. It said Hispanic students were like the lowest minority group in terms of going on to higher education. And so sometimes that assumption can almost be like a self-fulfilling prophecy if either teachers or the students themselves don't believe that that is in the future for them. It can cause them to not try as hard at school, both the teacher or the student. It could cause the student to not try or the teacher to not put in the effort to push that student to fulfill their full potential. So these are just some challenges. For teachers, I think the biggest thing is just been definitely to be intentional about reaching out to parents. This can be difficult, and so I say that's supposed to say staff. I need to fix that. But it's important to like use the preferred language of the parents. If you don't know Spanish, like I don't know Spanish, I would partner with the Spanish teachers at my school. I'm really good friends with Miss Gibson, who teaches, really good friends with Miss Gibson, who teaches Spanish at our school. And so I would use her as a resource to be able to translate things. If a school has a lot of Hispanic students, they might would consider hiring a bilingual interpreter to be able to communicate with parents. You should definitely translate all written communication so that they're accessible to all parents. I think this was advice from this article, How to Reach Out, but they advised teachers to learn Spanish themselves when they have Spanish speaking students. And this is something that's been really fun while teaching ESL is getting to talk about like the differences between English and Spanish and learn like as I'm teaching them English, they're teaching me Spanish a little bit, but it's important to kind of be mindful of that and be willing to learn Spanish yourself for your students. And again, that's supposed to say partner with bilingual staff. It's also important to educate parents on the US school system. So like our education system could be very different than what parents are used to, language minority parents. And so it's important to educate them on their rights as parents. It's important to educate them on the language program and what is happening both within the school and what might be offered outside of school. We can give advice on how they can work with their student at home, whether that's reading to them books in Spanish or taking their child to the library so that they can check out books in English. There's different websites and things they can use that just help parents know what they can do in order to best help their student. And then these were also some suggestions made by this article. They said that you could hold a Spanish back to school night, which again would probably be dependent on how many Spanish speaking ELLs you have. I know my district recently had just like a night where we showcased all of our different services. So it worked with our SPED department, it worked with the language teachers, it worked with our free and reduced lunch programs. And so all of those services were available for parents to come and talk to and reach out to on the same night. And we had a lot of our language minority parents come to that, and we had a translator there for them to be able to talk and just make sure they knew what their options were and knew all the information that they needed. You can also arrange for a bilingual person to give a tour of the school so that they have a better idea of what's going on with their child while they're away from them for 8 hours at a time. Continued, I mentioned this a second ago, but learning the differences between English and Spanish can be really important for teachers. Recently, with a student, I was talking about short vowel sounds. Like we haven't even gotten into all the different vowel sounds that we have in English, but I was trying to explain how in Spanish each vowel makes one sound, but in English they can make a bunch of different sounds. And there, my coworker at the language class was showing them like the word banana and how it's pronounced in English versus how it's pronounced in Spanish. And the student's mind was just blown of like, why would we do that? Like, that's so complicated. But knowing those differences can really help a Spanish student be able to get the English concepts you want them to learn. Can also expand your own horizons as a teacher. Another big suggestion is to read literature and create activities that represent Hispanic children and your other cultures of other children in the classroom. This is part of being like a culturally responsive teacher, and being just intentional with what materials you're giving your students and whose points of view you're putting in your classroom. Because if you're always just putting forth the same perspective, then that can be really off-putting for children and students. I know I teach English, and so I try really hard to have units that celebrate different cultures. Like we have an African American literature unit because a lot of my students are African American. We do a strong women unit. We've read different short stories from Arabic cultures. We just did a little folk tale from a Indian culture. And so it's just important to just be mindful of what information and what materials you're giving to your students. And lastly, it says use culturally appropriate pictures when teaching a new subject. And this goes back to, I think, one of the lectures really early in this in the class. We talked about how if you're talking about food, you shouldn't just put pictures of food that maybe are traditionally American. Like you just don't want to put up your hamburgers and pizza and French fries. You want to put up your empanadas and arepas if you have Hispanic students. If you're talking about toys, you might want to put pictures of toys that are more traditional to Hispanic cultures, and just again being mindful of the resources that you're using within the classroom. And lastly, I stole this from my friend Miss Gibson, who again works at Clinton Junior High School with me. And this was a project that she had her students do. This isn't as elaborate as what she had her kids do, but she did an activity where students created ofrendas as a way to celebrate the Day of the Dead, and also to sell. It was part of her unit on Hispanic Heritage Month as well. It was one of their like final things they had to do with it. She did a Google Slides version where students had to pick either like if they had a loved one that they felt comfortable creating an ofrenda for, they were able to do that, and they would include like some brief information about their loved one, and then included like their favorite foods and favorite drinks and candies and things that they might would put on their ofrenda. They were supposed to make it very decorative and pretty. And so I got to see some of the end results of that project. And one student made an ofrenda for her dad, who had passed away in the military in like 2016, I believe, and got to kind of memorialize him in that way. And then like another student created an ofrenda for her dog. And so it was just like they all got different opportunities to create something that was meaningful for them. And I think the students really enjoyed it. And this was a picture. It's blurry now that I see it all big on my screen, but this was I looked up like a Frenda project on Teachers Pay Teachers, and this was one that popped up that I thought was really neat because it has like the marigolds, which would have been traditional, and the flowers and all these beautiful like bright colors, as well as the pictures and the different like skulls and imagery that would have been very traditional. So yeah, these are the different sources that I used when creating this presentation. And I hope you maybe learned a little bit more about Hispanic culture. Have a great day.